Hello everyone, and welcome back to another edition of A Collection of Horrible Fates. There is an old anecdote about a doctor being asked what time period he would go back to if he had a time machine. In response, and quite tellingly, the doctor apparently immediately said something along the lines of, "I certainly wouldn't go back before antibiotics." And the final story in today's video demonstrates exactly why, and if you're squeamish, you might want to skip this one, or at least that final story. You'll see what I mean, and as always, viewer discretion is advised. For years, an anonymous French civil servant raised a family and did his tedious job to the best of his abilities. And with an apparent IQ of just 75, the man wasn't particularly bright, but he didn't seem to have a legitimate mental disability either. By all accounts, he led a relatively productive and fulfilling life. In fact, all things considered, he did amazingly well. But unbeknownst to him, his family, and his employer, he was absolutely singular in one particular area. Even now, nearly 2 decades after the case came to light, it challenges everything we know about intellect, consciousness, and what it means to be human. The man's background is a bit of a mystery. We don't know where or when he was born, where he lived and worked, or even his name, because his personal and medical information were never released to protect his and his family's privacy and identities. With that said, we do know that he was married, that he and his wife had 2 children, that he was relatively healthy, and that he was a diligent and competent civil servant. He seems to have led an unremarkable run-of-the-mill life on nearly every level, and he probably would have continued on in much the same fashion had it not been for mild pain and weakness he began experiencing in his left leg sometime in 2006. Initially, the 44-year-old did exactly what most of us would do in similar situations. He ignored the discomfort and hoped that it wouldn't get any worse, and with a little luck, it would eventually go away. After all, he didn't do anything to injure his leg. But even so, the symptoms continued for weeks, and the weeks eventually turned into months. The pain and weakness didn't get much worse during that time, but they didn't get much better either. So shortly thereafter, maybe at his wife's insistence, the man bit the bullet and scheduled an appointment with a local doctor. At their first meeting, the doctor asked about his medical history and the current state of his health. Then, when all the questions were out of the way, he examined the bothersome leg. Weirdly though, it seemed perfectly fine, and as such, the doctor had no idea what was causing the annoying pain and weakness. So as a last resort, the doctor decided to give the man a brain scan because at that point he suspected the condition might be neurological in nature. When the results came back, however, the otherwise relatively normal story took an insane, unexpected turn. The radiologist who initially examined the results assumed the MRI machine was actually broken because it looked like the man's skull was almost devoid of brain matter. If his medical training taught him anything, it was that a man with so little brain matter would be at the very least severely mentally disabled and more likely in a permanent vegetative state. However, since the patient was an employed family man of seemingly normal intellect, he checked the machine and did another scan, fully expecting to get far different results. But to his surprise, the results from the second scan were identical to the first. At this point, the radiologist and general practitioner reached out to a number of specialists to see if they could interpret the results and shed a little bit of light on the case. It would turn out that the man's head was mostly filled with fluid, and even more interestingly, his brain was little more than a thin film of gray matter that looked like it was clinging precariously to the inside of his skull. He was determined to suffer from a condition called hydrocephalus, or as it's more commonly known, water in the brain, or waterhead. Hydrocephalus is a relatively common but potentially life-threatening condition in which brain tissue erodes as fluid accumulates in cavities called ventricles inside the skull. And if the brain scan results were accurate, doctors concluded that he must have had the condition for 3 or 4 decades. This assessment was then confirmed by his childhood medical records, which showed that he was diagnosed with hydrocephalus as an infant. Back then, doctors attempted to treat the condition with a stent that drained away some of the excess fluid, but for some reason it was removed when he was 14 years old. After that, his brain seemed to steadily erode as the fluid continued to accumulate inside his head. Amazingly, doctors estimated the man lost nearly 90% of his brain between the ages of 14 and 44. All of this then led to the real question, which was how he'd been able to function at such a normal level when he should have been severely mentally disabled. The case first became relatively well known when it was published in The Lancet in 2007. In an instant, it seemed to prove that the human brain is far more mysterious and misunderstood than conventional wisdom believed. And at the time, it seemed to disprove much of what scientists and physicians thought they knew about one thing that's so near and dear to all of us, our consciousness. For a long time, consciousness was thought to reside in a specific location or locations deep inside the brain. But the Frenchman's story seemed to disprove these and other theories because his brain was far smaller and more atrophied than anything anyone had ever seen. And yet, he was a conscious and productive being who wasn't that much different than billions of other humans with so-called normal brains. And since his thin, atrophied brain worked almost exactly like theirs, it now seemed far more likely that consciousness didn't reside exclusively in any one particular area. However, here is where the story diverges from the headlines often seen around the internet. In 2017, a decade after the Frenchman's story first appeared, doctors and researchers eventually discovered that he didn't lose 90% of his brain like they had originally thought. Actually, the volume of his brain matter remained relatively constant, it just looked like the vast majority had eroded away because his brain had been pushed outward and compressed against his skull as fluid accumulated near the center. There was so much fluid that his brain had compressed almost like a sponge to the point of appearing as though 90% of it was gone. And as for the pain and weakness in the man's leg, it's anyone's guess if it had anything to do with his remarkably advanced case of hydrocephalus. These days, the man's life is much the same as it was when his condition came to light all the way back in 2006. The first known victim of the bubonic plague was a hunter-gatherer who died in modern-day Latvia around 5,000 years ago. After that, deaths from it were relatively few and far in between. At least they were until it showed up in Central Europe in the spring of 1347. It's generally believed that the outbreak originated in modern-day Kyrgyzstan in the late 1330s. But just a decade later, what would become known as the Black Death may have claimed as many as 100 million lives in Europe, North Africa, and Asia between 1347 and 1351. And of those, roughly half were in Europe, so to put that into perspective, between 30 and 60% of Europe's population was wiped out in less than 5 years. The plague is caused by a bacteria that are carried by fleas that live on rats, mice, and other furry vermin. The bacteria are present in the host animal's bloodstream and the flea's digestive system because the fleas consume the host's blood. The bacteria then spread when infected fleas move from one host to another. Symptoms of it generally occur in newly affected humans within 3 to 7 days and include fever, chills, nausea, headaches, and muscle soreness and fatigue. But it's the enlarged, pus-filled lymph nodes that give the plague its name. These most often appear in the neck, armpits, and groin, and unlike other more general symptoms, they serve as unmistakable proof that the sufferer has the bubonic plague. And while the bubonic plague is usually transmitted by fleas, it can also be transmitted from human to human when an uninfected person comes into contact with respiratory droplets, pus, or other bodily fluids from an infected person. And when a person is finally infected, the fatality rate is between 30 and 75%, and victims generally die between 2 and 7 days after symptoms first appear. The village of Eyam is located in the East Midlands, about 190 miles northwest of London, England. Estimates vary, but its population was somewhere between 350 and 800 in the mid-1600s. And while the Black Death decimated Europe 300 years before, the bubonic plague was still wreaking havoc in England at the time. This was particularly true in London, where crowded slums and poor sanitation created the perfect conditions for new outbreaks. As many as 100,000 Londoners may have died during a particularly potent resurgence that began in 1665 and ended the following year. These days, cars can travel from London to Eyam in about 4 or 5 hours, but back then, the trip by horseback or carriage took a week or more. The residents of Eyam knew what was going on in London in the mid-1660s, and they were aware that the plague could strike anywhere at any time, but the village's relative isolation and distance from the city gave some of them a false sense of security. Like towns and villages across the country, though, Eyam relied heavily on goods from the capital city. And in the otherwise pleasant summer of 1665, a tailor named Alexander Hadfield ordered woolen cloth from a wholesaler in London. As the story goes, a young man named George Vickers opened it shortly after it was delivered to Alexander Hadfield's shop. He apparently opened the package after noticing it was damp. He then unfolded the moist cloth, shook it out, and casually hung it near the fireplace to dry. But unbeknownst to him and everyone else in the village, the fire's warmth awakened a number of infected fleas. The following morning, George Vickers had sore muscles, a crippling headache, and a bad case of nausea. Initially, his symptoms weren't necessarily cause for alarm. For all he knew, he may have eaten something that didn't agree with him. He and his family realized it was something far more serious when the first pus-filled lymph node appeared, though. The next 2 days afterward were gut-wrenching for George Vickers and his family. His distraught wife and his stepsons watched helplessly as his condition rapidly deteriorated. The nodes got bigger and bigger while George got weaker and weaker, and to make matters worse, his family knew it was only a matter of time before they became infected too. Within a few hours, the whole village knew about the drama unfolding in the Vickers home. George Vickers would die 3 or 4 days after opening the package from London. He was the first plague victim of Eyam, but he wouldn't be the last. By then, the fleas had spread from person to person and house to house. At the time, villagers didn't really understand the precautions to take to contain the outbreak. So George Vickers' two stepsons, two of his neighbors, and the tailor Alexander Hadfield contracted the disease and passed away shortly thereafter. And from there, the plague gathered momentum and ravaged the village through the summer and into the fall. In some cases, entire families were wiped out, and nobody knew if the outbreak would last weeks, months, or years. Now, as the story goes, at the time, a man named William Mompesson was the village priest, and he realized that drastic measures would have to be taken. He then enlisted the help of the previous village priest, and although the men didn't know exactly what caused the outbreak, they suspected it had something to do with the package from London. They also saw it as their godly duty to slow the spread of the disease in the village and prevent it from spreading to nearby towns and villages. So they eventually agreed on a number of measures, the most drastic and crucial of which was a strict, self-imposed quarantine that they knew would condemn a significant portion of the village to death. But thankfully, after being told, the townsfolk agreed to the quarantine and to a number of additional measures. First, they promised to stay in their homes as much as possible and to bury their dead on their own property without any outside help. This was a huge concession because as people of faith, they believed the dead deserved to be buried in consecrated, or in other words, sacred ground. The villagers also agreed to stop worshipping inside the church because the two priests convinced them that it wasn't wise to congregate indoors. As these measures were being taken, the Earl of Devonshire spent tons of money supporting Eyam throughout the outbreak. But understandably, their reliance on outside goods actually increased during the ordeal because of the havoc the plague was causing. Also understandably, suppliers were wary about trading with the villagers, and so they came up with a system in which goods could be ordered, received, and paid for without the buyers and sellers coming into contact with one another. The two priests eventually proposed a special commercial zone outside the village known as the Boundary Stone. Villagers would then leave lists of the items they needed and the money to pay for them in holes that had been doused with vinegar, which acted as a disinfectant. After they returned to the village, merchants would go to the Boundary Stone area, retrieve the lists, take the money, and go back to their own villages to fulfill the orders. They'd then return to the Boundary Stone and leave the items for the villagers to pick up when they were gone. Thanks to this simple and efficient system, the village prevented the bubonic plague from spreading to the nearby towns and villages, some of which were less than a mile away. The number of new cases then dropped drastically in the winter of 1665, and in fact, only 42 deaths were recorded between September and December. This was in contrast to the brutal summer when the monthly death counts were far higher. If the trend continued, they held out hope that the village might even be plague-free by the following spring. Unfortunately, with that said, plague outbreaks typically weaken during the winter months because dropping temperatures kill large numbers of fleas. So the plague returned with a vengeance that spring and ravaged the village into the summer. However, strangely, some of the residents who came into contact with carrier fleas and plague victims remained unaffected or made full recoveries after relatively short sicknesses. In one case, a young wife and mother named Elizabeth escaped infection despite living with, caring for, and single-handedly bearing her husband and 6 children over an unthinkably harrowing 2-week period. According to legend, residents of the nearby Stony Middleton on a hill a mile away watched as the poor young woman dragged her family from the house and buried them in the yard one by one. In the end, the outbreak in Eyam lasted 14 months and claimed between 250 and 273 lives from nearly 80 different families. The last death occurred on November 1st, 1666, when a farm worker named Abraham Morton succumbed to the disease. Sadly, he was one of 18 Mortons listed as plague victims in the village. As for those who didn't die, centuries later, scientists discovered that most of the survivors had a special gene that protected them from the bacteria. And in fact, the gene still exists in the descendants of the villagers who survived the plague. However, pathologists generally agree that the villagers' and priests' selfless action saved hundreds or maybe even thousands of lives outside Eyam. As with most stories occurring hundreds of years ago though, some skeptical historians think the story may have been embellished. But if even some of the stories are true, the village's selfless and groundbreaking response to the outbreak was nothing short of remarkable, especially considering how little they knew about infectious diseases. But in any case, in the aftermath, additional outbreaks occurred throughout England and Europe for more than a century. A few were even reported in the early 1800s. And in total, as many as 15 million more lives may have been lost in China and India during the third plague pandemic that lasted from 1855 to 1960. Even today, the plague is still endemic to many countries, including Madagascar and the Democratic Republic of Congo. And while very uncommon in more developed countries, they're not immune either. Like, for example, one case of bubonic plague death was even reported in New Mexico in 2020. The room smelled of sweat, blood, and cigar smoke, and it was packed wall to wall with young men on wooden benches that circled the room. At its center was Dr. Robert Liston, who stood a head taller than most of the men around him. His next patient was wide-eyed and barely able to hold still from the pain, and he was being dragged to the table to be strapped down and held onto tightly. There was no anesthesia in those days, and so often the only pain relief came in the form of just a bottle of brandy. Robert then grabbed a knife and stepped toward a leg that needed to be removed. This was supposed to be a simple amputation by his own standards, one that he had done hundreds, maybe even thousands of times before. Just before the procedure began, Robert said what had become his catchphrase, asking those in the room to, quote, "Time me, gentlemen, time me." Then, in what seemed like just a moment later, the leg was separated. Just 2.5 minutes, that's all Robert needed to complete the amputation, but all was not well, and what happened next would go down in medical history. Now, Victorian-era surgery was not great, to put it lightly. Things like anesthesia, antiseptics, and hand washing had not yet been employed by surgeons. Operating rooms were agonizing, and most surgeons would make little to no effort to spare a patient the full experience. The primary objective wasn't even precision, it was speed. The faster a surgeon could get in, get out, and get a limb to the floor, the better the chance the patient had of not bleeding out or dying from sheer shock. Under these circumstances, Robert was extremely effective. While most surgeons took several agonizing minutes to saw through some tougher areas, Robert could do it in under 30 seconds in some cases, eventually earning the nickname the fastest knife in the West End. What really separated Robert from other doctors of the time, though, was his care for those he operated on. He had a strong sense of empathy and honed his speed because it was necessary in limiting pain as much as possible. Robert was born on October 28, 1794 in Scotland, and he was the son of a clergyman and inventor, and he inherited both his intelligence and imposing physique. By adulthood, he stood a towering 6'2", practically a giant by early 19th century standards, but it wasn't just his height that made him a big presence. He was first educated by his father at a local village school, and Robert showed early brilliance. At just 14 years old, he entered Edinburgh Medical School, and by 16, he was already assisting the anatomist Dr. John Barclay. In 1816, he took his skills to South London, trained under a famed surgeon, and then returned to Edinburgh to teach. 2 years later, in 1818, he became a house surgeon at the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh under Dr. George Bell. As all of this was going on, the public just wanted a chance to live through surgery at a time when mortality rates were around 40% for even the most minor procedures. Robert, though, was slightly different. He gained a reputation for preserving the lives of those he operated on in a way that was uncommon for the time period. And beyond that, he also cared deeply for doing things better. Faster, yes, but also safer, cleaner, and smarter. In 1837, he published Practical Surgery, and in it, he argued that surgery should be done with precision and above all speed. He also designed surgical tools that are still used in modified form today. He also changed how surgeons approached amputations themselves. Rather than simply removing, Robert developed techniques for leaving folds of skin that could be sewn back over to promote healing. This wasn't just better medicine, it was more humane, and it gave patients a real chance of recovery and even mobility in a time when many amputees died of sepsis. In December of 1846, Robert reached his greatest milestone. At University College Hospital in London, he became the first European surgeon to perform a public operation using modern anesthesia. The patient was put unconscious, and when they woke up, the procedure was complete. This was the beginning of a new era. But for all his incredible innovations, there were some missteps too. In trying to save lives with speed, he sometimes moved too fast. Like, for example, in one case, he apparently removed a leg so quickly that he accidentally castrated a patient in the process. There was another time where he apparently mistook a carotid artery aneurysm for a simple skin abscess. This would result in the affected man dying right there from major blood loss. Those instances, though, pale in comparison to his most famous surgery. After requesting those in attendance in the surgical theater to time him, the operation began like so many others in Robert's career. He was determined to make quick work of it, but something went wrong. In the heat of this, Robert not only went through his patient's leg, but he also took off several of his assistant's fingers. Then, in a blur of movement, Robert spun with his blade still raised and accidentally cut through the coattails of a distinguished doctor observing the procedure. This motion apparently startled the doctor so much that he dropped dead on the spot from a heart attack. Then the patient, despite the speed of the surgery, would later succumb to gangrene, which was common in pre-antiseptic wards at the time, as did Robert's assistant. This meant that it was one surgery that left 3 men dead. To this day, it's remembered as the only surgery in history with a 300% mortality rate. But if we're being honest, this story smells strongly of historical embellishment. It could very well be a medical urban legend passed around by med students. But even if the story is exaggerated though, if you had to go under the knife in 1840s London and you wanted a fighting chance of survival, you probably still would want Robert as your attending surgeon. Dr. Robert Liston died quietly and suddenly at the age of 53 from a brain aneurysm. He passed away just 1 year after helping usher in one of the greatest revolutions in medicine through the use of ether. He may be remembered for a botched operation that supposedly killed 3 people, but he's also revered for the thousands of lives he saved thanks to his forward-thinking care and ingenuity. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the forum found in the description. Also, if you want to support the channel, consider joining the Patreon or becoming a channel member here on YouTube. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.